What happens when one of the world's most powerful armies invades a nation of mountain fighters armed with little more than rifles, faith, and the will to resisting 1979? The mighty Soviet Union entered Afghanistan expecting a quick victory. It had tanks, helicopters, elite troops, and the strength of a global superpower. Standing against it were scattered guerrilla fighters, the Mujahideen. They had no unified army, no advanced weapons at first, and no control of the skies yet. 10 years later, the superpower withdrew in defeat. Welcome to History Ledger. We uncovered the real story of the Mujahideen versus Soviet superpower. Guerrilla fighters versus modern army. This is the story of a communist coup, a foreign invasion, mountain ambushes, helicopter warfare, covert Cold War aid, and the costly retreat that changed world history. How did lightly armed fighters challenge one of the strongest militaries on earth? How did Afghanistan become the Soviet Union's most painful war end? How did this conflict help reshape the final years of the Cold War, from the streets of Kabul to the hidden passes of the Hindu Kush? This is a true story of power, resistance, and consequences that still echo today. Let us begin. In the late 1970s, Afghanistan stood at the crossroads of history. It was a land of mountains, tribal loyalties, ancient trade routes, and fiercely guarded independence for centuries. Outside powers had struggled to dominate it. Now, another empire was about to try. April 1978, a violent coup erupted in Kabul. Military officers, aligned with the Communist People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, overthrew President Mohammad Daoud Khan. The event became known as the Soor Revolution. The new government declared that Afghanistan would be transformed through radical reform on paper. The promises sounded modern: land redistribution, education, equality, literacy campaigns, but in practice, these reforms were forced upon a deeply traditional society with a little understanding of local realities. Religious leaders were arrested, tribal elders were sidelined, rural customs were attacked by orders written in the capital. Many Afghans did not see progress. They saw an assault on faith, family, and centuries-old ways of life. Resistance began almost immediately across villages and mountain provinces. Armed uprisings broke out. Clerics denounced the regime. Tribal communities took up rifles. Government officials were targeted. What began as political unrest soon became open rebellion inside the communist government. Divisions made everything worse. Rival factions fought for control. Suspicion turned into purges. Executions spread fear through Kabul itself. Afghanistan was slipping into chaos to the north. The Soviet Union watched with growing concern. Afghanistan bordered Soviet Central Asia. Moscow feared instability near its frontier. The collapse of an allied regime and the possibility that foreign rivals could gain influence in the region. Soviet leaders debated whether to intervene. Some warned Afghanistan would become a trap. Others believed a short military operation could restore order quickly. In December 1979, the decision was made. Thousands of Soviet troops crossed the border. Armored columns rolled into Afghanistan. Transport aircraft filled the skies. Elite special forces moved toward the capital. Then came one of the most dramatic moments of the invasion. Soviet commandos stormed the Tajbek Palace, residence of Afghan leader Hafizullah Amin. After a fierce assault, Amin was killed in his place. Moscow installed Babra Karmel, a leader considered more reliable. The Soviet Union expected a swift and controlled mission: secure Kabul, stabilize the government, crush scattered rebels, return home. But Afghanistan was not a battlefield that obeyed simple plans. Soviet forces quickly occupied major cities, airports, and strategic roads. Their army was among the most powerful in the world. They possessed tanks, artillery, helicopter, gunships, armored personnel carriers, and highly trained troops. Against them stood local fighters armed with old rifles, limited ammunition, and little central organization. Yet strength on paper did not mean control on the ground. Beyond the cities stretched a landscape built for resistance: jagged mountains, narrow passes, deserts, and isolated valleys made movement difficult and supply lines vulnerable. Government authority faded with every mile from urban centers. In many regions, loyalty belonged not to Kabul, but to tribe, village, and faith. Resistance groups multiplied. Some were local militias defending their homes. Others were organized Islamist movements seeking national revolt. They differed in ideology, language, and leadership, but They shared one purpose: drive out the foreign army over time. They became known collectively as the Mujahideen, those engaged in struggle for Soviet soldiers. The war they entered was unlike anything they had trained for. There were no clear front lines, no single enemy headquarters, no decisive city whose capture would end the conflict. A convoy could pass safely one day and be destroyed. The next day, village could appear calm by morning and hostile by night. The human cost rose quickly. Bombardments, arrests, reprisals, and raids deepened anger among civilians. Families fled their homes. Refugees crossed into Pakistan and Iran carrying stories of violence and fear. The invasion also shocked the wider world. Cold War tensions intensified. Sanctions were imposed. International condemnation grew. What Moscow intended as a limited intervention was rapidly becoming a global crisis. A superpower had entered Afghanistan with confidence. It would soon discover that occupying the land was far easier than controlling it. By the early 1980s, the Soviet Union controlled the major cities of Afghanistan. Kabul remained in government hands. Large military bases guarded airports, highways, and strategic supply routes. On official maps, the state still appeared intact, but beyond those islands of control, another Afghanistan was fighting back. The Mujahideen understood they could not defeat the Soviet army in open battles. Soviet forces had tanks, artillery, helicopter, gunships, armored vehicles, and jet aircraft. To stand in the open against such firepower was to invite destruction. So the resistance chose a different kind of war. Small groups of fighters moved through mountains and valleys, striking where the enemy was weakest. They planted mines beneath roads used by military convoys. They attacked isolated outposts under cover of darkness. They ambushed patrols in narrow paths, then disappeared into villages or caves before reinforcements could arrive for Soviet commanders. The battlefield became deeply frustrating. They could seize territory during the day, only to lose influence by night. They could bombard a valley, then watch fighters return once the helicopters had left. Every convoy needed protection. Every patrol risked walking into an ambush. Geography of Afghanistan magnified every challenge. Towering mountain ranges cut regions apart. Snow blocked passes. In winter, dust storms swept the deserts. Roads were few, rough, and exposed in many places. Pack animals moved more effectively than armored vehicles. Soviet military responded with overwhelming force. Helicopter gunships became symbols of the war. They hunted rebel positions, escorted convoys, and attacked suspected strongholds. Artillery batteries pounded villages and mountain slopes. Air assaults inserted troops onto ridges and into remote valleys. Large sweep operations were launched to clear resistance areas. Some operations achieved tactical success. Weapons caches were seized. Fighters were killed. Temporary control was established, but strategic victory remained out of reach. Every strike carried a cost. Civilians often found themselves trapped between both sides. Farms were destroyed, irrigation systems were damaged, villages were abandoned, families fled with whatever they could carry. Millions of Afghans crossed into Pakistan and Iran, creating one of the largest refugee crises of the era in refugee camps and border towns. The war entered a new phase. Afghanistan had become a major front in the Cold War. The United States, determined to weaken its Soviet rival, expanded covert support for the resistance. Saudi Arabia provided funding. Other nations contributed money, weapons, and supplies. Pakistan became the critical gateway. Training camps were established near the border. Arms shipments moved through secret networks. Political influence over the resistance also flowed through these same channels. Yet the Mujahideen were never a single united army. They were a patchwork of factions, tribes, commanders, and ideologies. Some leaders became famous for battlefield skill. Others gained power because of outside backing. Rivalries were constant. Disputes over territory, weapons, and authority often divided the movement. Still, pressure on Soviet forces never stopped for ordinary Soviet soldiers. Morale began to erode. Many were young conscripts sent far from home into a war they barely understood. They faced hidden enemies, brutal terrain, and constant danger from mines and surprise attacks. Letters sent home spoke of exhaustion, fear, and confusion. Meanwhile, casualties quietly mounted. Then came one of the most important turning points of the war in 1986. Advanced American-made Stinger missiles began reaching some Mujahideen groups. These shoulder-fired weapons could target low-flying aircraft with deadly accuracy for years. Soviet helicopters had dominated many battle zones. They could strike villages, support ground troops, and move freely through difficult terrain now. Pilots faced a new threat from unseen positions in the hills. Resistance fighters could suddenly fire missiles capable of destroying aircraft in seconds. The military effect was significant. Flight patterns changed, missions became more dangerous. Helicopters were forced to adapt their tactics, but the psychological effect was even greater for the Mujahideen. The stinger symbolized hope for Soviet troops. It signaled that the war was becoming harder, not easier, and still there was no decisive battle, no surrender ceremony, no final victory parade. There was a slow, grinding reality. Every convoy attacked, every aircraft lost, every month of stalemate, every village destroyed. Every soldier buried. The Soviet Union still possessed more firepower than any force in Afghanistan, but time was no longer on its side. The machines of a superpower could crush targets, yet they could not easily defeat an enemy that refused to stand still. By the mid-1980s, the war in Afghanistan had become a wound the Soviet Union could no longer hide for years. Official propaganda had described the intervention as international duty and socialist solidarity, but behind those slogans stood rising casualties, growing economic strain, and no clear path to victory. The operation that was supposed to be swift and limited had become a draining war of attrition. In 1985, a new leader rose in Moscow. His name was Mikhail Gorbachev. Inherited an aging superpower burdened by stagnation, political rigidity, and expensive commitments. Across the world, Afghanistan was one of the heaviest burdens of Gorbachev reportedly described the conflict as a bleeding wound. It was a phrase that captured the growing reality inside the Kremlin. Soviet forces could continue fighting, but continued fighting would not guarantee success. It would only deepen the damage. Military operations still continued. Convoys crossed dangerous roads. Airstrikes hit suspected resistance areas. Soviet advisors supported Afghan government troops. Large bases remained active, yet the basic truth had not changed. Cities could be held. Roads could be patrolled. Valleys could be bombed. Resistance endured. The Mujahideen remained divided, but they were still capable of attacking supply lines, harassing outposts, and making long-term occupation costly. The Soviet army could punish them, but it could not eliminate them. At the same time, the world itself was changing. The Cold War was entering a new phase. Diplomacy, reform, and arms control were beginning to replace constant escalation in that environment. Ending the Afghan war became increasingly urgent. Negotiations moved forward under international mediation after years of bloodshed. The Geneva Accords were signed in 1988. The agreements created a framework for the withdrawal of Soviet forces from Afghanistan and commitments related to non-interference. Then, the retreat began. Armored columns rolled north. Bases were handed over. Troops crossed bridges and border checkpoints that once carried them into war. Television cameras captured the moment as history turned on. February 15th, 1989. The last official Soviet combat forces departed Afghanistan for the It was proof that determined resistance could outlast a superpower. Lightly armed guerrilla fighters, fragmented and imperfect, had survived against one of the largest military machines on earth for the Soviet Union. The consequences reached far beyond Afghanistan. The war had exposed weaknesses in leadership, planning, and morale. It had consumed resources the economy could scarcely spare. It had shaken public confidence and intensified doubts about the future of the Soviet system. Within 2 years of the withdrawal, the Soviet Union itself would collapse. But for Afghanistan, victory did not bring peace. The communist government in Kabul did not fall immediately. It survived for several more years, supported by remaining aid and divisions among its enemies. Meanwhile, the factions that had fought side by side against the Soviets now turned their weapons on one another. Old rivalries. Regional commanders competed for territory. Rockets struck cities. New rounds of civil war devastated a population already scarred by invasion. Out of that chaos, new forces would rise, including the Taliban. In the 1990 ESTA conflict that began with a superpower intervention would continue, shaping global history long after Soviet troops were gone. The human cost was immense. Of thousands were killed, millions became refugees, Villages, farms, roads, and institutions were shattered. A generation of Afghans grew up knowing only war end. The legacy remains deeply Remember the struggle as a heroic resistance against foreign occupation others. Remember the destruction, radicalization, and instability that followed. Historians still debate how much the war accelerated the fall of the Soviet Union, and how much it reshaped the modern world. But one fact is, beyond dispute, the Soviet army entered Afghanistan expecting to secure a fragile ally instead. It became trapped in a conflict that changed both nations forever. In the mountains of Afghanistan, a modern superpower discovered the limits of military force, and the echoes of that war still have not faded. The Soviet Union entered Afghanistan expecting to restore control in weeks. It spent 10 years trapped in a brutal war it could not win. Fort Mujahideen. It was a victory of endurance against overwhelming force for Afghanistan. It was only the beginning of decades of conflict and for the world. It was a reminder that even the greatest military power can be defeated when it misunderstands the land, the people, and the cost of occupation. But the story does not end here, because after the Soviet withdrawal came civil war, the rise of the Taliban, and a new chapter that would draw another superpower into the same mountains. If you want to see that next story, make sure to watch our upcoming episode. Thank you for watching History Ledger. If you enjoyed this true historical documentary, please like, share, and subscribe if you have not yet. And until next time, remember, history never truly disappears. It only waits to be told again.